Hello, and welcome to an episode that takes a slight detour from my usual discourses, and instead focuses on the somewhat niche subject of Final Fantasy's recurring characters, Biggs and Wedge, with particular regard to their appearance in 1999's Final Fantasy VIII. Now, Biggs and Wedge have something of a cult status among fans of the series, and it's common knowledge that their origins reside in being an homage to the eponymous Star Wars characters Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles, who appear in the Battle of Yavin at the end of A New Hope. Their relative consistency in the franchise usually sees them paired together, often as soldiers of some sort, in a fleeting secondary and antagonistic capacity. Perhaps the most notable exception to this being their appearance as AVALANCHE freedom fighters in Final Fantasy VII. And on this note, their reimagining in the remake footage has created something of a renewed buzz around their presence within the franchise, and particularly the Final Fantasy VII universe. Further to this, Tetsuya Nomura noted way back in 2015 that he wanted to explore Biggs, Wedge and Jessie a whole lot more in the remake of 7. So we may well see their most involved appearances to date once Final Fantasy VII finally gets re-released. It's also prudent to note around the mythology of Biggs and Wedge that they tend to make the most prominent appearances in installments that have been helmed by Yoshinori Kitase, particularly Final Fantasies 6, 7, 8 and 10. And indeed, Kitase has stated in interviews before that watching Star Wars as a child inspired his study of film and screenwriting at university, and also his later trajectory as a producer and director in the video games industry. So it seems like he's firmly responsible for the prominence and the appearance of these gag characters in the aforementioned games. So aside from being retrospectively crowbarred into Final Fantasy IV, Biggs and Wedge made their first solid appearance in the opening moments of Final Fantasy VI. Their significance here can't be understated because the conversation they have establishes salient points such as the Empire's expansion, the search for espers, and most importantly, Terra's unstable nature and power being dubiously repressed by the slave crown. Their presence, however, is short-lived in the game, as their deaths are among the first to occur, with the esper swiftly dispatching them in the opening moments, in the same instant that it finally wakes up Terra. Moving on to Final Fantasy VII, we see Biggs and Wedge once again providing narrative context and gameplay onboarding in the opening moment, alongside their companion Jessie, who is a unique feature to Final Fantasy VII. In this instance, the trio, particularly Wedge and Jessie, are designed to elicit some emotional investment and empathy from the player, as their early dialogue hinges around their good intentions and their general amicability towards Cloud and the player. The payoff for this comes with their brutal deaths during the Sector 7 platefall, and this is intended to make Shinra responsible for the deaths of, directly relatable characters, and thus the player feels some degree of sorrow and indignation at their passing. This event is compounded by the fact that we find Biggs, Wedge and Jessie kind of mangled and suffering on the pillar staircase, and they utter their final words to Cloud as we head up towards our first boss fight with Reno. So I think it's fairly certain that we can expect some sort of cinematic melodrama. If Nomura follows through with his wish to feature Biggs and Wedge more prominently, I can picture this platefall scene being quite cinematic when they re-release that game. And in terms of embellishing their stories, it would be interesting to see whether this is done via NPC references or flashback scenarios after their deaths, or indeed perhaps some DLC specific content, which remains to be seen. Now, moving on to the next rendition of Biggs and Wedge, Final Fantasy VIII saw them survive the events of the game for the first time, and while I did touch on these guys back in my Final Fantasy VIII discourse, I feel that they warrant consideration here because, along with Laguna, Kiros and Ward, they bring a very humorous edge and counterbalance to the game, to the otherwise quite morbid storyline and existential distress of our Siege students, and particularly the protagonist, Squall. Their inclusion perfects the balance of Final Fantasy VIII as a game, in my opinion, and I feel that, due to this humorous injection they offer, the game touches on all emotional bases, offering this comic relief to offset the severity of Squall's mission and personality. They also succeed in positing the Galbadian soldiers as much more than mindless antagonists that we need to, quickly dispatch, which we basically see in all the predecessing games. The soldiers are just in the way, they're obstacles. But rather, with Final Fantasy VIII, we see that these are career soldiers with hopes and dreams and opinions about things, that through the characterization of Biggs and Wedge, who come to question their orders, and they question their role in society, and eventually question whether constantly getting their asses kicked by Squall, whether that's really worth it. So their inability to catch a break and their hapless back and forthing are a typical odd couple dynamic, which is often used in media, and particularly movies. Whether we're looking at buddy cop movies like Rush Hour or Tango and Cash, oddities like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas or Jay and Silent Bob, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, or comedies like Californication, Blackadder, and With Now and I. The humour elicited from two fundamentally flawed and different people being held together by some commonality is always great grounds for character development and dialogue-based humour. In the case of Final Fantasy VIII's Biggs and Wedge, we see Biggs as a commanding officer who's bossy, overconfident, yet fundamentally misguided with his ability to conduct basic tasks, particularly when it comes to exterminating Squall and Co. As is often the case, the more servile of the odd couple, in this case Wedge, is often attempting to implore or convey some common sense to their counterpart. And right from their opening scene in Final Fantasy VIII, we find Wedge discussing rumours of a monster on the roof of the communications tower, and he's kind of mentioning this to Biggs, who basically ignores him right up until Elvorat shows up to attack them. Shortly thereafter, we see Biggs, much like a Looney Tunes character trying to catch a rabbit or Roadrunner, summoning the infamous robot spider to chase Squall and Co. out of Dole. But chiefly what this sequence also does is instill this personal vendetta in the hapless soldiers, and particularly Major Biggs, who, as a result of his incompetence, receives a demotion to lieutenant. Much like the Turks, who are recurring run-ins in Final Fantasy VII, we once again see the two appear as guards in D District Prison, where they convey their dismay to the party. And finally, the payoff for these two in this kind of micro-narrative and this incompetence is that we finally see them contemplating their lives while we're in the lunatic Pandora. Now, this is prudent to mention, and while I don't want to build up fleeting characters too far beyond their relevance, I think it's great that Biggs and Wedge didn't get killed off or disappear, but rather they were given quite an optimistic and open-ended conclusion to their story, where, one would hope they go on to discover their aptitudes and, perhaps have a positive reinvention of themselves in the wake of this realisation. Although I have spoken to more cynical friends in the past who assure me that they probably would have been shot for desertion, but I really don't think that was the intention or the case with this ambiguous end for them. Their change of heart is also emblematic of Galbadia's crumbling grip on power. Vinza Dilling is long since dead, and both the Sorceress and Cypher are consumed by this maniacal aim of theirs. So it's only right that the regular army are starting to question their purpose, and this is conveyed, again, perfectly through the avatar of Biggs and Wedge. So, the penchant for the comic and the ridiculous have always enamoured me to Final Fantasy VIII's story and Final Fantasy VIII's imagining of Biggs and Wedge, and one can't help but laugh at how irredeemably useless they are as soldiers. But moving now on to the latter appearances of Biggs and Wedge, it's only really Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII that embellished them to any true degree. Final Fantasy X has them as recruitable blitzball players, and 12 and 13 have subtle allusions to them through anagrams and initialed shopfronts. But it's not really until Final Fantasy XV that we see a narratively pertinent Biggs and Wedge feature. And they appear as soldiers working for Aranea. So seeing this, and seeing their kind of funny accents, I was hoping that them coming in the guise of soldiers would re-emerge this ridiculous incompetence, or at least humour kind of elicited from, since Final Fantasy VIII. But they proved to be much more sensible and reserved additions to the game, rather than these kind of prominent Easter eggs that 7 and 8 sought to establish with them. So that about wraps up my considerations of Biggs and Wedge. Short and sweet, I know. But I've long since wanted to discuss them and their recurring appearance as, micro-inclusions and micro-story additions, particularly to the PS1 generation of Final Fantasy games.